Hi, this talk is based on my book, Poo, Pee and Paper, Humanity's Relationship with Bodily Waste. My book is available from Amazon and all good booksellers. The paperback, only £7.50 or $10. The Kindle, only £2.50 or $3.50. My book has been getting very good reviews on Amazon. So far, all 5-star reviews, as well as good written reviews. This one I particularly liked from the United States. I'm shocked this book hasn't gone viral. Well written, researched, informative and very entertaining. A must read for a history buff or anybody who's just interested in stuff. This book deserves a much wittier review than mine, but maybe I'll think on it and come up with something. Meanwhile, I hope more people discover this book and give it the high ratings that it deserves. My research into the history of toilets has taken me into some very rough places. So, did Thomas Crapper invent the flushing toilet? No, because the Neolithic settlers in the Orkney Islands had indoor flushing toilets over 5,000 years ago. This picture shows a typical home from the area. Because of the hostile weather, the occupants really didn't want to leave the comfort of their stone huts to go to the toilet. So the toilets were inside, in a walled-off section. Running rainwater was channeled into the toilet to wash out the waste. In Britain, in the mid-Victorian era, most houses didn't have inside flush toilets. People went to a privy in the garden, and the accumulated poo was used as a fertiliser. After 5,000 years, most people were worse off than their Neolithic ancestors. Even today, 600 million people worldwide do not have access to a personal toilet. The Sumerians had extensive pipe sewerage disposal systems in their towns 5,300 years ago. Their design for toilet seats is very similar to modern seats. Both have a gap at the front to allow users easy access for the purpose of personal cleaning. One important modern need for the front gap is to protect airline passengers from being sucked onto the toilet if seated when the toilet is flushed. If you think such stories are urban myths, then read my book. The highly developed and sophisticated Minoan civilization had an advanced sewer disposal system in their towns and cities. The Minoans installed underground clay pipes beneath Knossos to supply fresh water and to take away sewerage and rainwater. These tapered pipes were carefully designed to fit together to create curved paths, and their cross-section was elliptical, which helped the water flow to scour out any sediment. Modern sewer pipes are also elliptical for the very same reason. At each cemented joint between the pipes, there was a nozzle which created a jet of liquid to clean out the next pipe. At regular intervals, there were drain pits which collected sediment. These were frequently cleared by hand to ensure the efficient flow of sewerage over long distances. In the palace were toilets having wooden seats, flushing water, and a non-return system for discharging the bodily waste into the underground sewer. The Harappans, who lived in what is now Pakistan around 6,500 years ago, had ensuite facilities annexed to their bedrooms, in which the toilets were flushed into a cesspit well away from the house. The Egyptians had showers enclosed in drained stone trays, and adjacent toilets which had wooden seats which were much more comfortable than the stone seats used by other civilizations. Herodotus, who lived 2,400 years ago, noted the unusual toilet habits of the Egyptians, in that the women peed standing up, whilst the men crouched down. Not all ancient civilizations were so sophisticated. The Trojans, for example, just peed and pooed in the streets in front of passers-by. 2,000 years later, Londoners were doing the same. The Romans had by far the most sophisticated sewerage systems in the ancient world. Indeed, it surpassed what the average European had to put up with until the mid-1800s. Soon after the building of Rome, a huge sewerage system was installed called the Cloaca Maxima, which was looked after by the goddess Cloacina, the deity of sewers and filth, seen here on this coin. This ditty was used on Victorian chamber pots. O Cloacina, goddess of this place, look upon thy servant with a smiling face. Soft and cohesive let my offering flow, not rudely swift, not obstinately slow. The main sewer pipe under Rome was 16 feet wide, and in 33 BCE, the Emperor Marcus Agrippa went on a trip all the way down the sewer in a boat rowed by 8 slaves. Touring sewers also became very popular in the 19th century, as shown by this picture of a large group of elegant Parisian ladies being taken on a trip down the sewers of Paris. The huge sewer under Rome is still in use 2,400 years later, but it now just carries rainwater from the streets. Incidentally, the Romans used the urine of Portuguese men as a mouthwash, while the Greeks used donkey milk. I know which one I would have preferred. The Roman obsession with cleanliness resulted in some magnificent buildings. For example, the baths at Caracalla in Rome would accommodate over 10,000 people at any one time. And it was enormous, as shown in this comparison with St. Paul's Cathedral. The water systems for these baths held the equivalent of 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. In its glory days, Rome had 1,352 fountains, 144 public toilets, and 856 public baths. The city used 6 times as much water per head of the population as modern London. This picture shows typical Roman communal toilets. The waste was flushed away by a stream of water under the seats. Cleaning was done with a sponge on a stick dipped in vinegar, using the slot in the front of the toilet seat. 2,000 years later, these were the toilets at the Auschwitz concentration camp. What progress was made in those 2,000 years? Moving forward in time to the Vikings, excavations in York have shown that they emptied their bowels around and even into drinking water wells. From poo collected and analysed around York, it has been discovered that Vikings ate cereals, fish and berries. Bowel diseases were endemic, however, including infestations by whipworm, roundworm and moorworm. These worms migrate to other organs such as the ears and the nose of the unfortunate sufferers. Maybe that explains why the Vikings were so unpleasantly violent after rowing for weeks on a ship full of men suffering from painful diarrhoea, cramping stomach pains and orifices full of irritating worms. Before moving our story on to the filth and pestilence of medieval times, I want to introduce you to the chamber pot, that essential item for avoiding the long walk down the garden in the rain to the privy. In medieval times, a great deal of medical diagnosis was based on the colour and smell of a patient's urine. Urine was collected in a glass bottle called a Jordan. This was because crusaders used to bring home water from the River Jordan in them. This is a typical medieval chart used to identify ailments. The Jordans were also used to save getting out of bed to have a pee in the night. Chamber pots have been around for over 2,000 years, and we see 2 examples from the Far East, one Chinese from the 3rd century and one more modern Japanese from the 17th century. Here we see a chamber pot under the bed, where a maiden is being ceremonially deflowered, whilst the priest looks on. The couple in the bed do not seem to be enjoying the experience. The chamber pot on the left has a monkey painted on the inside, and the instruction around the outside says, "Keep me clean all week, and what I see I will not tell." Using a chamber pot in Regency times must have been an art, with so many skirts, underskirts, and crinoline cages. Ladies over many centuries would have problems with bladder control during church services, when priests would happily drone on for 2 hours or more. So the Bodily was invented for their comfort. They would discreetly hide the Bodily until needed, slip it under their voluminous dresses, and when they finished peeing, they would pour the contents on the floor. The urine would, over decades, soak the floorboards and produce saltpetre, which is one of the 3 components in the manufacture of gunpowder. Gangs would go into churches and rip up the floorboards soaked in stale urine and sell them to the gunpowder manufacturers for a substantial profit. In the reign of Charles I, Thomas Hilliard and Nicholas Stevens became saltpetre millionaires by collecting urine-soaked material wherever it could be found. "The women piss in their seats, which causes excellent saltpetre," said Stevens to the outraged parish clerk at Chipping Norton Church as they tore up the seats and loaded them into their carts in the churchyard. Stevens and Hilliard caused such upheaval they wound up in court, where they were accused of unlawful digging "in all the places without distinction, as in parlours, bedchambers, threshing floors, malting houses, and shops. Yea, in God's own house they have not forborne, but have digged in churches, hallowed chapels, and churchyards, tearing men's bones and ashes out of their graves to make gunpowder of." Here we see a cartoon mocking Napoleon by showing him seated on a huge chamber pot. In the 18th and 19th centuries, chamber pots were kept in most rooms, even dining rooms, so that family and visitors could relieve themselves without having to leave the room. The drunkard on the left appears to be having trouble pointing Percy at the porcelain. It is said that when Beethoven was absorbed in his composing, his chamber pot placed by his piano would overflow and a stream of urine would run across the carpet. Moving on the history of toilets to post-Roman times, we have 17 centuries of filth and disease. Whilst the peasants pooed and peed outside their cottages into holes dug into ground, the wealthy installed garderobes in their castles. The garderobe was a seat over a chute in an outer wall. The human waste slid down either into a moat or onto the ground, where the peasants collected it to fertilise their crops. The smell in the garderobe was so strong that the castle inhabitants hung their best clothes in there, because clothes moths could not live in the pungent atmosphere. The garderobe was one of the weakest parts of the castle's defence. For example, in 1069, Godfrey the Hunchback, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, was killed by an assassin who bravely stood under the garderobe chute, waiting for the Duke to have his daily poo. Then, when the faeces started to fall upon him, he thrust a long spear up the chute, killing the Duke instantly, no doubt with his eyes watering. History was changed even more dramatically when Martin Luther was sitting on a garderobe, struggling with a particularly painful bowel movement. He was also in mental turmoil because he couldn't choose whether to marry a wealthy and sexy young lady or become a monk. In his physical and mental struggle, he cried out to Saint Anne for help. His bowels eased instantly, and in gratitude he became a monk. And look where that led. One result was that King Henry VIII became a Protestant and founded the Church of England. And so it is that our noble king owes his role as head of the Anglican Church to Martin Luther's painful bowel motion. London was typical of all large cities in medieval times. Rivers were used as sewers, and the foul stench and pollution of drinking waters caused great illness and loss of life. Cattle, pigs, and sheep were brought into London in vast numbers. There were more animals brought in for slaughter than there were citizens. These animals were killed, and the waste was thrown into the streets, where it could accumulate to knee depth. In 1290, the prior of a Carmelite house in Whitefriars complained of the River Fleet's noxious exhalations, the miasma of which had killed many of the hooded brethren, and the corruption of which overpowered the odours of the incense. The Blackfriars and the Bishop of Salisbury, whose palace was in Salisbury Court, Fleet Street, also signed the same petition. In 1355, Edward III set up an inquiry because the dyke next to the Fleet prison was so deep with liquefied human excrement that it was possible to float a substantial boat on it. Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, mentions the filth in the River Fleet in a poem of 1710. Sweepings from butcher stalls, dung, guts and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud, dead cats and turnip tops come tumbling down the flood. There is an apocryphal story of a pig being driven to London's Camden Market. It slipped and fell into the River Fleet, where it was swept away into a culvert. The farmer sadly watched his young porker disappear. However, a few months later, the very same pig reappeared near Blackfriars, fit and well, and nearly double the size it was when lost. The Fleet's burden of animal intestines and offal, together with copious supplies of human poo, had fattened it up. Right up until the middle 19th century, most people used a privy, which discharged into a cesspit in the ground, which, when full, was covered over and a new hole was dug nearby. In 1844, no fewer than 53 overflowing cesspits were discovered under Windsor Castle, causing widespread illnesses amongst the servants. Prince Albert set about replacing the commodes, which had to be carried through the castle to be poured into holes dug anywhere that was free. However, he died in 1861 of typhoid, probably contracted from the overflowing cesspits, just as his grand scheme of introducing flushing toilets was about to start. Queen Victoria, in her widow's grief, ordered everything to stay the way it was in her castles, and the overflowing cesspits remained, resulting in further deaths of many servants and household staff. The cesspits in the towns and cities were emptied by the night soil men, and the excrement was carried away to be dumped in the local rivers by the cartload or sold to farmers as fertilizer. Here we see a well-dressed gentleman coming to grief when he walked too close to a night-soiled cart being loaded with human excrement. It was traditional for chamber pots to be emptied out of windows onto the street. Pedestrians would shield themselves with umbrellas made of leather. Wealthier residents had close stools. These were called commodes, which was named after the Roman emperor Commodus, as made famous in the film Gladiator. Despite the abundance of closed stalls and chamber pots in royal palaces, there was an awful lot of pooing and peeing done in hallways, on stairs, and against palace walls. For example, the mother of Louis XIV was caught peeing behind a tapestry in Versailles. Livestock was sometimes found to be wandering around the Grand Gallery, not the impression of opulence and grandeur popularly promulgated. In 1606, the French Dauphin wrote an edict forbidding anyone from pooing and peeing in the rooms, corridors, or on the stairs of the Palace of Saint-Germain. This edict was ignored, including by the Dauphin himself, who habitually peed against the highly decorated walls of his bedroom. Perhaps the pinnacle of peeing chic was performed by the Count of Guillaume, a friend of Louis XIV, who was caught short during a formal ball in 1658 and peed into his dance partner's hand muff. Palaces, such as Versailles, stank of excrement and urine because of the courtiers' habits of just peeing and pooing in all the rooms and stairways. The garden paths at Versailles and Fontainebleau were scattered with piles of human poo, festering away under the hot sun. Sewers were built in cities, but these were crude and inadequate. Most houses still use cesspits. Diarist Samuel Pepys made much use of his admirable closed-stall commode. However, he had problems with his neighbour's sewerage system, as he wrote in 1660, "And going down into my cellar to look, I put my foot into a great heap of turds, by which I find that Mr. Turner's house of office," which was a polite euphemism for his toilet, "is full, and comes into my cellar, which doth trouble me." Mr. Turner, the diarist's neighbour, had let his cesspit overflow into Pepys' cellar. When the Albert Hall was built in 1871, no toilets were provided, so that patrons had to go outside and pee and poo into people's adjacent gardens. It was little wonder that disease was rife due to the contaminated water supplies and the excrement laying around in the streets. This chart shows the average life expectancy of men in mid-Victorian England. We see there is a huge contrast between the professional trades in Rutland, for example, who could expect to live to at least 52, compared with labourers in a poor area such as Bolton, who didn't even reach the average age of 20. The low figures are mostly a reflection of the very high child mortality rates. In the poorest areas, fewer than half of children reach their 5th birthday. In my own case, my mother had 2 siblings, both of whom died before their 1st birthdays. The cause of death on their certificates was acute diarrhea and exhaustion. Jumping back to 1596, we come across Sir John Harrington, one of Queen Elizabeth I's 102 godchildren. He was the inventor of the flushing toilet as we now know it. This toilet had all the components of the modern system, namely a cistern for holding the water, a valve to release the water to flush the bowl, and a one-way system to allow the excrement to pass through while shutting out the smell. Unfortunately, although Harrington installed one of his toilets in Queen Elizabeth's palace, the very first royal flush, so to speak, they never caught on. One reason may have been that all that flushing water filled up the cesspits much quicker and they cost more to empty. Harrington's toilet turned out to be just a flush in the pan, so to speak. We must move forward 179 years for the next development in toilet design. Joseph Bramah invented and patented 2 devices of immense value to humanity: the first practical mass-produced toilet and the beer pump. He also invented an unpickable lock. He offered a prize of £45,000 in today's money to the first person to pick his lock. This was achieved in 1851 by a visitor to the Great Exhibition 37 years after Bramah's death. Bramah also invented a self-sharpening pencil and the hydraulic press. The installation and development of the toilet really took off at this point. Top centre, we see the first toilet to use the S-bend to keep out smells from the sewerage system. Top right is an elaborate type of toilet pan used in Queen Victoria's palaces. Bottom right and the pull chain handle is by Thomas Crapper. The handle on the chain tells users to pull and let go, because high system toilets with a chain were a novelty and users were unsure what to do. There is a large and perfectly preserved Thomas Crapper lavatory at Wesley's Chapel and Laysian Mission in London. I visited it a couple of years ago and it's amazing. These pictures are from my visit. And it's free to go in. Having mentioned Thomas Crapper, it's time to dispel a few myths. Did referring to poo as crap originate with his name? The word crap derives from a group of obsolete dialect words related to the Middle English word crapper, and Dutch krappen, and Old French crappy or crappen, all of which referred to the husks and other waste left behind after grinding wheat. In general, it was used in the sense of something being useless rubbish or waste material. The use of the word crap as a vulgar term for pooing was first written in 1846 when Thomas Crapper was just a young child, so the widely held association of his name with the act of going for a poo is false. However, Crapper's name was seen emblazoned on many toilets in late Victorian times, as we can see in this picture, and throughout the first half of the 20th century. So it's not surprising that this false attribution grew in strength. It's probable that the phrase going to the crapper was invented by American soldiers billeted in England in World War I after they saw Thomas Crapper's name on toilet systems. This may have been the way these expressions made their way to the United States, where toilets are still referred to as crappers. Plumbers got their name from the Latin word plumbum for the lead they used in their pipework. Plumbers have gained a possibly unjustified reputation over the centuries for arriving on the wrong day, coming without the necessary tools, flirting with the girls in the household and overcharging for their services. Certainly, the householder in this cartoon is expressing a very dim view of the plumber, attending more to his maid than to the leaking tap. The rapidly rising demand for toilets, baths and running water to be installed in the houses of the wealthy in the late 18th century and throughout Victorian times created a demand for plumbers that could not be satisfied. Plumbers had a dangerous job, apart from the consequences of getting serving maids pregnant. They could be blown up by exploring a sewer with a naked flame lamp. They could be attacked and infected by rats, and they could be struck down with many sewerage-borne diseases such as typhoid, dysentery and cholera. I'm moving on now to the history of toilet paper. As long as 1,400 years ago, the Chinese were manufacturing toilet paper. This was produced in large sheets and sold in boxes. By the 1300s, over 1 million packets of toilet paper, each containing over 1,000 sheets, were being produced each year. In 1393, over 15,000 sheets were produced annually for the Emperor Hingwu alone. Meanwhile, outside China, many things have been used for bum wiping. Aristophanes' play Plutus has a slave boasting about how his master has risen up the social hierarchy and acquired such wealth that the slaves no longer have to wipe their arses with stones but have garlic stalks instead. In the rest of the world, people used old clothing torn into strips. In coastal areas, clam and oyster shells were used to scrape soiled bottoms. In the USA, corn cobs were used into the early 1900s. Often these would be dyed pretty colours to add ambience to the outhouse. James Whitcomb Riley, 1849 to 1916, was moved to write an ode in praise of the corn cob's cleaning qualities, thus: "But when the crust was on the snow and sullen skies were grey, in sooth the outhouse was no place where one would wish to stay. We did our duties promptly there, one purpose swayed the mind. We tarried not, nor lingered long on what was left behind. The torture of the icy seat would make a Spartan sob. for needs must scrape the goose-flesh with a lacerating cob, that from a frost-encrusted nail hung pendant by a string. My father was a frugal man, and wasted not a thing. In the late 19th century, corn cobs and newspapers rapidly disappeared in toilets. It was discovered that the Sears and Roebuck catalogue, which started publication in 1894, was ideal for bum wiping. It was given away free, it was thick, and the paper was absorbent. It was also very interesting to browse. Despite its admirable wiping properties, it was mocked as the Rears and Sawbutt catalogue. Many publishers of large popular catalogues even provided a hole in the top corner through all the pages so that it could be hung up in the toilet. New Yorker Joseph Gaiety first produced paper sheets in the USA specifically for bum wiping in 1857. This was sold as Gaiety's Medicated Paper, a perfectly pure article for the toilet and for the prevention of hemorrhoids. His toilet paper was made from manila hemp, as was also used for making ropes. His rivals advertised their toilet paper as guaranteed free of splinters. I'm going to move on now to describe the huge civil engineering project directed by Sir Joseph Bazalgette, whose memorial stands on the Thames embankment close to the Underground station. Between 1820 and 1840, it was estimated that the number of flushing toilets in London had grown by a factor of 10, and 200,000 cesspits had been closed. This put an intolerable strain on the existing sewer network. It also vastly increased the amount of sewerage being carried into the Thames, which turned into a stinking and fetid river. The city's drinking water was drawn directly from the Thames, often, as shown in this cartoon, from points where the sewers were discharging raw excrement into the river. Cholera was endemic, with 4 major outbreaks between 1832 and 1866, which ravaged London communities and led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The government set up several commissions which recognised the urgency and deadliness of the problem, but nothing happened. In part, this was because the cost of building a new sewer system for London would cost £570 million in today's money. The internationally famous scientist Sir Michael Faraday took a boat trip up the Thames to inspect its condition, and he was appalled. He tested the turbidity of the water by dropping pieces of white card and measured how far they sank until they became invisible. That distance was just 1 inch. Still nothing happened, despite the rapidly growing toll of cholera victims. This cartoon was published in Punch magazine after Faraday's report of his trip down the Thames. It shows microscopic life forms infesting a drop of water. The characters were all based on contemporary political and government figures, as well as aldermen, deputies and common councilmen, who were being blamed for the terrible and deadly state of London's streets, sewers and river. It was not just cholera that was killing people. This picture shows the aftermath of a massive explosion caused by the build-up of methane in the overloaded sewers. The long hot summer of 1858 created an event that Parliament could no longer ignore: the Great Stink. The fetid Thames, overflowing with sewerage and dead animals, was creating such an overpowering stink alongside the Houses of Parliament that parliamentary business was suspended. Sheets soaked in chloride of lime were hung over windows in a futile attempt to keep out the stench. Sir Joseph Bazalgette was finally given the approval to start his enormous task of building a new sewer system for London. The first thing he did was to task the Ordnance Survey to produce huge maps of London at a scale of 25 inches to 1 mile, showing every house and its precise height above the Thames mean level, so that he could plan every connection and make sure the drains would be at the correct slope such that gravity would transport the sewerage out of London. This took quite a few years, and then the digging started. The main collecting sewers, marked in yellow, were 82 miles in length, and the smaller connecting sewers totaled 1,100 miles. The sewerage mainly fell gradually under gravity to 2 collecting points well downstream of London, shown by the red circles. One huge pumping station was needed, shown by the blue circle. This picture shows the size of the main collecting sewers. This picture shows a remarkable yet relatively small part of the sewer system construction. It shows the newly created Victoria Embankment in 1867, which included, in addition to a huge underground sewer, an underground steam railway, which became the District and Circle line of the London Underground, as well as gas, electricity and water pipes. Many areas of London were transformed with huge embankments built alongside the Thames, such as the Albert Embankment, Victoria Embankment and the Chelsea Embankment. All of these were built to cover the huge sewers running adjacent to the Thames. Several major bridges over the Thames were either built or existing bridges significantly improved, such as the Albert Bridge, Putney Bridge, Hammersmith Bridge and Battersea Bridge. Major streets in London were greatly rebuilt and improved, including Charing Cross Road, Garrick Street, Northumberland Avenue and Shaftesbury Avenue. Plans were also made for what would become the Blackwall Tunnel and Tower Bridge. The cut and cover method was favoured, as it was cheaper than tunnelling, but caused more disruption. The whole project was colossal in scope. It required 318 million bricks and 270,000 cubic yards of concrete. Inevitably, there were accidents during such an enormous project. This shows the aftermath of a massive collapse and explosion. The sewerage could only be discharged into the Thames when the tide was ebbing, otherwise the sewerage would have gone back into London. The sewerage then had to be stored for hours, waiting for the tide to ebb twice a day. This picture shows part of the reservoirs used to store the liquid sewerage. 140 million tonnes of sewerage pass through these reservoirs every year. The discharge stations at Crossness and Abbey Mills were gloriously fitted out and decorated, like ancient temples to excrement. The Crossness and Abbey Mills discharge stations are open to the public many days each year, and I thoroughly recommend a visit. Unfortunately, the amount of sewerage discharged at each ebbing tide produced thick layers of excrement where the Thames estuary met the North Sea. In 1878, there was a collision between 2 ships in this area. One was a very large freight ship which hit and sank a smaller passenger ship. Over 600 people were flung into the water where they wallowed in recently discharged excrement and all drowned. The bodies were recovered over a period of a week, by which time most had bloated with festered sewerage to the point that they would not fit in normal coffins. Following this tragedy, All sewerage discharged from the two outfalls were loaded onto boats, called Bovril boats, and carried out to be dumped in the North Sea well away from land. This stopped in the early 1990s. Now, half of London's human waste is incinerated to generate electricity, and the rest is sold as dry pelleted fertiliser. By the start of the 21st century, Bazalgette's amazing sewer system was being overloaded, so a new main sewer has been tunnelled, mainly under the Thames. This new sewer is 24 feet in diameter and runs for 16 miles. Bazalgette's 1,100 miles of secondary sewer pipes survive and feed into the new pipe. The cost of this new sewer is about £5 billion. Some abandoned underground toilets have been converted into bars, nightclubs, shops, art galleries and even apartments. Here are a few pictures I've taken of toilet conversions, which I have personally visited. This is an underground toilet converted into a nightclub. It even has its own glitter ball as you go in. Here is an Edwardian underground gents' toilet, which has been converted into a bistro. I had a great visit. I sat with my feet in a urinal, eating a sandwich and drinking a coffee. And this is a rather nice wine and charcuterie bar. And finally, here are some popular inventions from recent times. This one is a unisex urinal to be used by men or women. And here we have an excellent game for men to play to encourage them to be more accurate when they're having a pee. My wife wondered why I was in the toilet so long. I told her I was trying to score a hat trick. Finally, please remember to do your bit to save the planet by recycling your pee. Thank you for letting me entertain you. There are many more stories in my book, and all profits are being donated to a children's hospice in my glorious home county of Dorset.